You know that feeling when you wake up on a Sunday morning thinking it's going to be just another day. Maybe you're planning to sleep in, grab some breakfast, write a letter home. That's exactly what December 7th, 1941 started out as for me. Just another Sunday in paradise. Except it wasn't. Because by the time that day was over, I'd witnessed the single most devastating attack on American soil. I'd watched my friends die. I had seen ships that seemed indestructible torn apart like they were made of paper. And I had survived something that, honestly, I still don't fully understand how I made it through. My name is... well, that doesn't matter as much as what I'm about to tell you. Because this isn't just my story. This is the story of 2,403 Americans who never made it home. This is the story of a nation that woke up one way and went to bed completely different. This is the story of the day that changed everything. And I was there. I was on the ship when Pearl Harbor was attacked. Let me take you back. December 6th, 1941, the evening before everything changed. I'm 19 years old. Just a kid, really, though I thought I was all grown up at the time. I joined the Navy about 8 months earlier, looking for adventure, looking to serve my country, and honestly, looking to get away from the farm in Iowa, where I'd spent my whole life up until then. Hawaii seemed like a dream posting. I mean, can you imagine? Coming from the freezing winters of the Midwest to this tropical paradise with its warm breezes, crystal blue water, and palm trees everywhere you looked. We thought we'd hit the jackpot. I was stationed on the USS West Virginia, one of the most powerful battleships in the Pacific Fleet. We called her WV, this massive 32,000-ton warship that stretched 624 feet long. When you stood on her deck, you felt invincible. These ships seemed unsinkable, untouchable. On that Saturday night, December 6th, a bunch of us had liberty. We went into Honolulu, grabbed some dinner, maybe had a few drinks, though I won't confirm that since I was technically underage. We laughed, we joked around, we talked about the upcoming Christmas leave some of the guys were hoping to get. The world felt normal, safe. Sure, we knew there were tensions with Japan. Everyone knew that. The officers talked about it sometimes. We'd heard about the Japanese expansion in Asia, the embargoes, the diplomatic tensions. But Pearl Harbor. This was American territory. This was our fortress in the Pacific, with the entire Pacific Fleet anchored right there in the harbor. Nobody thought they'd actually attack us here. Nobody. I got back to the ship around 2300 hours. That's 11 p.m. for you civilians, and headed to my bunk. I was bunking below deck in the compartment where dozens of us sailors slept in those stacked racks that barely gave you room to roll over. It was hot, it smelled like sweat and oil, and too many guys in too small a space, but it was home. I remember lying there that night, exhausted from the day, listening to the sounds of the ship. The creaking of the hull, the snoring of the guys around me, the distant sound of someone laughing somewhere above deck. I fell asleep thinking about breakfast. I fell asleep thinking it was just another Sunday. 07:55 hours. December 7th, 1941. That's when my world exploded. I'm not speaking metaphorically. I mean, the world literally exploded around me. I woke up to a sound I'd never heard before. This screaming, whistling noise followed by an impact that shook the entire ship. The whole vessel lurched, throwing me out of my rack. I hit the deck hard, completely disoriented. For a second, just a second, I thought maybe we'd had some kind of accident. Maybe another ship had hit us, or we'd run aground somehow, even though that didn't make any sense since we were anchored. Then the second explosion hit, and the third. And the general quarters alarm started blaring, and someone was screaming, "This is not a drill! This is not a drill!" And I realized we were under attack. Now, I need you to understand something. When you're below deck on a battleship during an attack, you're basically trapped in a metal coffin. You can't see what's happening. You can't see the sky. You can't see the enemy. You can't see anything except the panicked faces of the men around you and the walls of steel that are suddenly feeling a lot thinner than they used to. All you can do is feel and hear. And what I felt was the ship shuddering with each impact. What I heard was the sound of metal tearing, of explosions that were so loud they felt like physical blows, of men screaming. We scrambled to get to our battle stations. I was part of a gun crew, so I needed to get topside. But getting there, that was its own kind of nightmare. The passageways were chaos, men running in every direction, some heading to their stations, some already wounded and trying to get to the medical bay. The lights were flickering, smoke was starting to seep into the compartments, and every few seconds another explosion would rock the ship, sending us sprawling. I remember grabbing onto a railing to steady myself, and my hand came away wet. In the dim emergency lighting, I could see it was blood. Someone else's blood smeared on the metal. That's when it really hit me. This was real. People were dying. I pushed forward, following the crowd of sailors trying to get topside. We climbed ladders, pushed through hatches, fought our way up through the smoke and the chaos. And then I emerged onto the deck. Nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what I saw. Picture this for a second. Close your eyes and really try to imagine it. The sky is full of planes, not our planes. Japanese planes with those red circles painted on their wings, the rising sun emblem that would haunt my dreams for years afterward. There had to be dozens of them, maybe more, swarming over the harbor like angry hornets. The water, that beautiful clear blue water I'd admired so many times, was on fire. Actually on fire. Oil from the ruptured ships had spread across the surface, and it was burning, creating these massive walls of flame that reached up toward the sky. The air was thick with smoke, so thick you could barely breathe. It burned your lungs, made your eyes water. And the smell, God, the smell, burning oil, burning metal, burning other things. Things I don't want to describe. And the noise. I don't think I can adequately describe the noise. The scream of plane engines as they dove toward us, the thunder of anti-aircraft guns, ours and from other ships, firing at anything that moved in the sky, the explosions, constant, overlapping explosions that made it feel like the whole world was tearing itself apart. The screams of men, the groaning of metal as ships twisted and broke. It was like standing inside hell itself. I could see other ships across the harbor, and they were in bad shape. Really bad shape. The USS Oklahoma, she'd already capsized, just rolled over like someone had flipped a toy in a bathtub. I found out later that over 400 men were trapped inside her when she went over. The USS Arizona she was gone. I mean, she was still there physically, but she'd taken a hit to her forward magazine. That's where they stored the ammunition. And she'd just erupted. This massive fireball had shot hundreds of feet into the air. Even from where I was, I could feel the heat from that explosion. 1,177 men died on the Arizona. Almost half of all the casualties that day. Most of them died in seconds when that magazine went up. But I didn't know those numbers then. All I knew was that ships were dying, men were dying. And we were next. Our ship, the West Virginia, had already been hit. Multiple times, actually, before I even made it topside. We'd been struck by at least 2 torpedoes, maybe more. The ship was listing, tilting to one side, and taking on water fast. I made it to my gun station and found half of my gun crew was already dead. Just gone. A bomb had hit nearby and the fragmentation had torn through them. I'd eaten breakfast with those guys just yesterday. Now they were gone. But there was no time to process that, no time to grieve or even really understand what I was looking at. Because the planes kept coming, and if we didn't fight back, we'd all end up like them. I jumped into position and we started firing. Have you ever tried to hit a moving target? Now imagine that target is a plane moving at over 200 miles per hour, diving and weaving and turning, while you're standing on a ship that's shaking from explosions, tilting as it takes on water, surrounded by smoke so thick you can barely see. We fired anyway. We fired everything we had. Our anti-aircraft guns, our machine guns, even rifles. Some guys were just shooting rifles at the planes, which probably didn't do much good, but at least made them feel like they were doing something. And sometimes we actually hit them. I saw one Japanese plane, a dive bomber, I think, take a direct hit from one of our 5-inch guns. It just disintegrated in midair, turned into a ball of fire and debris that rained down into the harbor. Every time we got one, a cheer went up. Even in the middle of all that death and chaos, men still cheered. Because that was one less plane dropping bombs on us. That was one less pilot trying to kill us, but for every plane we shot down, there seemed to be 2 more taking its place. The attack came in waves, you see. This wasn't just one group of planes hitting us and leaving. No, they'd planned this carefully, meticulously. First wave, second wave, hitting us again and again, giving us no time to recover, no time to organize any real defense. It was brilliant, in a terrifying sort of way. And it was working. Time did weird things during the attack. Sometimes it felt like everything was happening in slow motion. I could see a bomb falling from a plane, tumbling through the air, and it felt like I had all the time in the world to watch it fall, to see exactly where it was going to hit, to know exactly what was about to happen. Other times, whole minutes would just disappear. I'd be firing the gun, and then suddenly I'd realize I couldn't remember the last 3 or 4 minutes. They were just gone, lost in the adrenaline and the chaos. I don't know exactly how long I was at that gun station. Could have been 30 minutes. Could have been an hour. Time had stopped meaning anything. But I remember specific moments with perfect clarity. I remember looking over and seeing the USS California settling lower and lower in the water as she took on more damage. She was sinking, slowly but surely, and I could see men jumping off her deck into that oil-slicked burning water. I remember watching a Japanese torpedo plane come in low over the water, so low I swear I could have hit it with a rock if I'd had a good arm. It was heading straight for us, and I thought, this is it. This is the one that gets us. We fired everything we had at it. I don't know if we hit it or if it just released its torpedo early, but it dropped its payload and veered off. The torpedo missed us. By how much, I don't know, but it missed. I remember seeing a young officer, couldn't have been more than 25, standing on an exposed position on the deck, completely calm, directing fire from the anti-aircraft guns. He was acting like he was on a practice range, not in the middle of an attack. A bomb hit close to him. The concussion threw him across the deck like a rag doll. He got up, shook his head like he was shaking off a hit in a boxing match, and went right back to directing fire. I found out later he received the Medal of Honor for his actions that day. He deserved it. I remember one of the guys in my gun crew, Jimmy from Texas, always talking about his girl back home. I remember him suddenly grabbing my arm and pointing at the water. There were men in the water. Dozens of them. Swimming away from the sinking ships, trying to get to shore, trying to get to anywhere that wasn't a ship being torn apart by bombs and torpedoes. But the water was on fire. They were swimming through fire. Some of them made it. Some of them didn't. We couldn't help them. We couldn't do anything except watch and keep firing at the planes and hope that maybe, if we shot down enough of them, this would end. Our ship kept taking hits. With each torpedo strike, with each bomb that found its mark, the West Virginia listed more and more to port. That's the left side for you non-nautical folks. We were tilting at this crazy angle, and it was getting harder and harder to keep our footing on the deck. The ship was dying. We all knew it. You could feel it in the way she moved, or rather, stopped moving. Battleships are supposed to be alive in a way. You can feel them responding to the water, to the engines, to everything. But the West Virginia was becoming dead weight, settling lower into the harbor with each passing minute. Someone made the decision to counter flood. That means they deliberately flooded compartments on the other side of the ship to balance out the flooding from the torpedo hits. It was a desperate move, but it worked. Instead of capsizing like the Oklahoma had done, we settled more or less upright, but that meant the ship was flooding. On purpose. While we were still on it. Think about that for a second. We were deliberately sinking our own ship with us on it, to prevent it from rolling over and trapping even more men inside. The order came to abandon ship. I didn't want to leave. I know that sounds crazy, but I didn't want to leave my station. This was my ship. This was where I was supposed to be. What was I supposed to do? Just jump into that hell of burning oil and swim away? But orders are orders, and the ship was going down whether we stayed on it or not. We started making our way to the side of the ship to abandon, and that's when things got even worse. If you can believe things could get worse. Getting off a sinking, burning battleship that's under attack is not like just jumping off a dock into a swimming pool. The deck is tilted at this insane angle. There's fire and smoke everywhere. Debris is falling from above as bombs continue to hit. The water below is a mixture of oil, fire, and floating wreckage, and men. Dead men, floating in the water. I saw guys jump into the water and immediately get pulled under by the suction from the sinking ship. I saw guys jump and land on debris and get injured. I saw guys hesitate too long and get caught by another explosion. When it was my turn, I didn't think. I just jumped. The fall felt like it lasted forever. Then I hit the water, and it was like hitting concrete. Knocked the wind right out of me. I went under, and for a terrifying moment, I couldn't tell which way was up. Everything was dark and churning and burning. My lungs were screaming for air. I kicked and clawed my way to what I hoped was the surface. I broke through, gasped in a breath that was half air and half smoke, and immediately started swimming. Away from the ship, away from the suction that was pulling debris and men down with it, toward... I didn't even know. Just away. The oil in the water was thick, coating everything. It got in my mouth, in my eyes, made it almost impossible to breathe, and parts of it were on fire. Not everywhere, thank God, but in patches. You had to swim around the flames, had to constantly be aware of where the fire was, because if you got caught in it, I saw men get caught in it. I'm not going to describe what I saw. Some things don't need to be described. Some things shouldn't be. I swam for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. Other guys were around me, all of us trying to get to shore, trying to get to anything solid. Some were helping wounded sailors stay afloat. Some were just swimming in shock, not even really aware of where they were going. A small boat, I think it was a motor launch from one of the other ships, came by and started pulling people out of the water. They grabbed me, hauled me up like a wet sack of potatoes, and suddenly I was out of the water, collapsed on the bottom of this boat, coughing up oil and seawater. There were maybe 10 of us in that boat, some wounded, some just exhausted. Nobody was talking. We just sat there, shaking as the boat made its way to shore. And the whole time, the attack continued. Planes were still screaming overhead. Explosions were still tearing apart ships across the harbor. The sky was still dark with smoke. It was like the world had decided to end, and we just happened to still be alive to watch it. The boat got us to shore. Ford Island, the little island in the middle of Pearl Harbor where they had an airfield. We stumbled off the boat and onto solid ground. I'd never been so happy to feel dirt under my feet. But there was no safety there. Planes were strafing the island. That means flying low and shooting at anything that moved. We had to run for cover, had to find anywhere that offered protection. I ended up in a ditch with about 20 other guys, most of us from different ships, none of us really knowing what we were supposed to do now. We'd lost our ships, we'd lost our units, we'd lost everything. One guy, I never got his name, was trying to make a head count of his crew. He kept saying, "Where's Johnson? Has anyone seen Johnson? What about Rodriguez?" Nobody had answers. We didn't know who'd made it and who hadn't. Another guy was wounded, hit by shrapnel in his leg. A couple of sailors were trying to bandage it with torn pieces of their own shirts. There wasn't much else we could do for him, and we just waited, hiding in a ditch on Ford Island while the world burned around us. You want to know what the worst part was? It wasn't the bombs. It wasn't the torpedoes. It wasn't even watching the ships sink. It was the waiting. Because we didn't know when it would end. We didn't know if this was just the first wave of a full-scale invasion. We didn't know if Japanese troops would be landing on the beaches in the next hour. We didn't know if there were more planes coming, if they'd be back tomorrow, if this was just the beginning of something even worse. We didn't know anything. So we waited in that ditch, flinching at every plane that flew overhead, tensing up at every explosion, wondering if the next bomb had our name on it. I don't know how long the attack actually lasted. I've read since that it was about 2 hours from start to finish. 2 hours? 120 minutes. That's all it took to cripple the Pacific Fleet. But when you're in it, time doesn't work that way. Those 2 hours felt like 2 days. Or 2 minutes. Or both, somehow at the same time. Eventually, the sound of plane engines started to fade. The explosions became less frequent. The air raid sirens were still going, but there were no more planes in the sky. It was over. Or at least this part was over. Slowly, we started to emerge from our hiding spots. The scene that greeted us was, I don't have words for it. I've tried to describe it to people over the years, and I've never quite managed to capture what it looked like. Pearl Harbor was destroyed. Not completely. Some ships had escaped damage or only taken minor hits. But the heart of the Pacific Fleet was gone. Battleships that had seemed invincible that morning were now sinking, burning, or beached. The harbor itself was choked with debris and oil and the detritus of war. And the bodies. God, the bodies. I'm not going to dwell on this because it still gives me nightmares, but understand, 2,403 Americans died that day. Those weren't just numbers. Those were men. Young men, most of them. Kids, really. They were brothers and sons and husbands and fathers. They had families waiting for them back home. They had lives they were supposed to live. And they were gone. The hours after the attack were chaos of a different kind. Those of us who could were organized into work parties. We searched for survivors in the water and in the wrecked ships. We fought fires that were still burning on multiple vessels. We tried to provide medical care to the wounded with whatever supplies we could scrounge up. The medical facilities were completely overwhelmed. They'd been set up to handle routine illnesses and minor injuries, not mass casualties from a military attack. Wounded men were lying on every available surface, tables, floors, patches of grass outside. Doctors and nurses were doing their best, but there were just too many casualties and not enough hands to help. I ended up as part of a crew trying to fight the fires on the West Virginia. Our ship, our home, was still burning, listing in the shallow water where she'd settled. We sprayed water on the flames, tried to keep them from spreading to other ships nearby, tried to save what little we could save. At one point, I was standing on the dock looking at the West Virginia, and I just broke down, started crying right there. I'm not ashamed to admit it. A lot of guys cried that day. This petty officer, I didn't know him. He was from another ship. He came over and put his hand on my shoulder. Didn't say anything. Just stood there with me for a minute while I pulled myself together. Then we got back to work. Because that's what you do. You break down, you pull yourself together, and you get back to work. Night fell on December 7th, 1941. Normally, Pearl Harbor at night was beautiful. The lights from the ships reflecting on the calm water, the stars overhead, the warm, tropical breeze. It was the kind of place that made you understand why people called Hawaii paradise. That night was different. There were no ship lights reflecting on the water because half the ships were dark, sunk or dead in the water. The stars were hidden behind a pall of smoke that hung over the entire harbor like a funeral shroud. And the breeze carried the smell of burning oil and death. We were under blackout conditions. No lights anywhere because we didn't know if the Japanese were coming back. Every time we heard a plane engine, even if it was one of our own, everyone tensed up. I spent that night on Ford Island with hundreds of other displaced sailors. They'd set up some kind of temporary shelter situation, but there wasn't enough space for everyone. A lot of us just found a patch of ground and tried to sleep. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it all over again. The planes, the bombs, the fire on the water, the faces of the guys from my gun crew who didn't make it. I wasn't the only one. All around me, guys were sitting up, staring at nothing, or having quiet conversations in the dark. Some were praying, some were writing letters home, or trying to, even though we couldn't mail them yet and didn't know when we'd be able to. One guy was sitting against a wall, just smoking cigarette after cigarette, staring at the glow from the fires still burning across the harbor. I sat down next to him, didn't say anything, just sat there. After a while, he spoke. "I was supposed to rotate stateside next month," he said. "Had my orders and everything. Going home to Oregon." I didn't know what to say to that. "What do you say?" "Now," he continued, taking a drag from his cigarette, "now I don't think any of us are going anywhere for a long time." He was right about that. The next few days were a blur of activity. The Navy was trying to figure out what we had left, what could be salvaged, what was total loss. They were organizing survivors, accounting for the dead and missing, trying to restore some kind of order to the chaos. Those of us who'd lost our ships were reassigned to whatever needed doing. I spent days helping with the rescue and recovery efforts. We were still finding survivors, guys who'd been trapped in air pockets in the sunken ships. Every time we pulled someone out alive, it felt like a miracle, but we were also recovering bodies. A lot of bodies. I'll spare you the details of that. Just know that it had to be done, and we did it. The USS Arizona was still burning. She burned for 2 days after the attack. 2 days. And we knew there were hundreds of men still trapped inside her, but there was nothing we could do. The fire was too intense. The damage too severe. Eventually, they decided to leave her where she was. A tomb for the 1,177 men who died aboard her. Even now, all these years later, she's still there in Pearl Harbor, with oil still slowly leaking from her fuel tanks. They call them the Tears of the Arizona. The scale of the damage became clearer as the days went on. 8 battleships damaged or destroyed. 3 destroyers sunk, 3 cruisers damaged, nearly 200 aircraft destroyed, and those 2,403 casualties, 2,335 servicemen and 68 civilians. The Japanese had achieved almost total surprise and had dealt us a devastating blow. But, and this is important, they'd made mistakes too. They'd focused on the battleships, which made sense from a tactical perspective. But they'd missed the oil storage facilities. They'd missed the repair yards, and most importantly, they'd missed our aircraft carriers, which weren't in port that day. Those misses would come back to haunt them. On December 8, 1941, President Roosevelt addressed Congress. We gathered around any radio we could find to listen. Hundreds of sailors, cramming into spaces designed for dozens, just to hear what the president had to say. His words are famous now. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Infamy. That's the word he used. And he was right. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph. So help us, God. When he asked Congress to declare that a state of war existed between the United States and Japan, we cheered. Even exhausted, even grieving, even surrounded by the wreckage of our fleet, we cheered. Because now we could fight back. The attack on Pearl Harbor was meant to destroy American military power in the Pacific and break our will to fight. It did the opposite. It unified the country in a way nothing else could have. Isolationism died that day along with those 2,403 Americans. We were in it now, all of us, and we were going to see it through. I want to take a moment here to talk about something that's important to understand. Pearl Harbor wasn't just a military defeat. It was a trauma. A national trauma, yes, but also a personal trauma for everyone who was there. We didn't have words like PTSD back then. We didn't have trauma counselors or mental health resources. You were just expected to deal with it, to push through, to be tough. So that's what we did. We pushed it down, locked it away, and got back to work. But it didn't go away. Not really. For years, decades afterward, I'd have nightmares. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, hearing those plane engines, smelling that burning oil, seeing the faces of guys who didn't make it. Sometimes I still do. Loud noises would make me jump. Fireworks on the 4th of July. Forget about it. I couldn't watch them without being transported back to that day, to those explosions, to that chaos. I wasn't unique. A lot of guys who survived Pearl Harbor carried those scars for the rest of their lives. Some dealt with it better than others. Some turned to alcohol. Some just withdrew, became shadows of who they'd been before. War does that. It changes you, and you can't ever really go back to who you were before. The kid from Iowa who joined the Navy looking for adventure, he died on December 7th, 1941, even though his body survived. In the weeks and months after the attack, Pearl Harbor became a hive of activity. The recovery efforts continued. They raised some of the sunken ships. The West Virginia was eventually refloated, repaired, and returned to service. She'd go on to fight in several major battles later in the war. Ships that had seemed destroyed beyond repair were rebuilt. The harbor was cleared of debris. America's industrial might, which had been dormant during the Depression, roared to life. Factories started running 24 hours a day, churning out ships, planes, weapons, ammunition. Women went to work in those factories in numbers never seen before. The whole country mobilized. And guys like me? We got reassigned. I was eventually transferred to another ship. I won't say which one because this isn't about the rest of my war experience. It's about Pearl Harbor. But I served for the duration of the war, from December 1941 to September 1945. I was one of the lucky ones. I made it through the whole war without serious injury. A lot of guys didn't. But Pearl Harbor stayed with me. It stayed with all of us who were there. You want to know something that might surprise you? For years after the war, I didn't talk about Pearl Harbor. Not to my family, not to my friends, not to anyone. It was too raw, too painful. I'd survived, yes, but talking about it meant reliving it, and I'd already relived it enough in my nightmares. A lot of Pearl Harbor survivors were like that. We'd get together at reunions sometimes, and we'd talk around it, but not directly about it. We'd remember the guys who didn't make it. We'd share a drink to their memory. But the actual attack, that stayed locked away. It was only later, much later after I'd retired, after my kids were grown, that I started to really process what had happened, started to talk about it, started to understand that bearing witness was important. Because here's the thing, those 2,403 Americans who died that day can't tell their stories. They can't bear witness to what happened. So those of us who survived have an obligation to do it for them, to remember, to tell the truth about what happened, to make sure that their sacrifice wasn't forgotten. That's why I'm telling you this story now. Let me tell you about some of the guys who didn't make it. There was Doris Miller. He was a mess attendant. Back then, black sailors weren't allowed to serve in combat positions, so he worked in the kitchen. But when the attack came, he didn't stay in the kitchen. He carried wounded sailors to safety, then manned an anti-aircraft gun, a weapon he'd never been trained to use, and fired at the attacking planes until he ran out of ammunition. He became the first African-American to receive the Navy Cross. He died 2 years later when his ship was sunk in the Gilbert Islands. There were the 37 sets of brothers who died at Pearl Harbor, 37 pairs of siblings who served together and died together. The 5 Sullivan brothers are famous. They died later in the war when their ship was sunk, but they weren't the only brothers lost. There was the entire band of the USS Arizona. All 21 members of the ship's band died when the magazine exploded. They'd been on deck preparing to play colors, the morning flag ceremony, when the attack started. There was Ensign Joe Tausig. He lost a leg in the attack but refused to leave his post, continuing to direct fire from his gun position even as he bled. He survived, but he carried the scars of that day for the rest of his life. There were the pilots from the mainland who flew into the middle of the attack, not knowing what they were flying into. Several of them were shot down, some by Japanese planes, some by our own anti-aircraft fire, because we were shooting at anything in the sky. Every single one of the 2,403 casualties has a story, had a life, had people who loved them and missed them and mourned them. I didn't know most of them personally, but I carry them with me anyway. The thing about Pearl Harbor is that it wasn't just a military attack, it was personal. These weren't faceless enemies attacking some abstract target. These were pilots who looked us in the eyes as they flew over, who saw our faces as they dropped their bombs and fired their torpedoes. And we were sailors, eating breakfast, writing letters home, planning our day. We were kids, most of us, who thought we were safe. The surprise of it, the audacity of it, made it feel like a violation, like someone had broken into your home and attacked you while you slept. That's why the response was so intense. That's why the whole country rallied. It wasn't just about military strategy or geopolitics. It was personal. They'd attacked us in our home, and we were going to make them pay for it. I've been asked, over the years, if I hate the Japanese for what they did that day. It's a complicated question. Do I hate the military leadership that planned and ordered the attack? Yes, absolutely. They started a war that killed millions of people, and it began with a surprise attack on a Sunday morning. Do I hate the pilots who flew those planes? That's harder. They were following orders. They were serving their country, just like I was serving mine. War is war, and in war, people kill each other. That's the terrible truth of it. Do I hate the Japanese people? No, never did. War was declared between nations, not between peoples. After the war, I actually visited Japan, saw the devastation that we'd inflicted on them in return, the firebombing of Tokyo, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, saw Japanese civilians trying to rebuild their lives, just like we'd rebuilt ours. War is a terrible thing. It's necessary, sometimes, maybe. I'm not a pacifist, and I think we were right to fight World War II. But it's always terrible. And holding on to hate after it's over doesn't bring back the dead or heal the wounds. What I carry isn't hate, it's memory. And there's a difference. Pearl Harbor changed the course of history. If the attack had never happened, would America have entered World War II? Maybe eventually, but maybe not. There was strong isolationist sentiment in the country. A lot of people thought Europe's war was Europe's problem, and Asia's war was Asia's problem. Pearl Harbor ended that debate instantly, completely, permanently. It united the country in a way that nothing else could have. Democrats and Republicans, rich and poor, every race and ethnicity. Suddenly we were all Americans first, and we had a common enemy. The war that followed was brutal. It lasted almost 4 more years. It was fought across the Pacific and in Europe, in deserts and jungles and frozen forests. Millions died, but we won. And Pearl Harbor was the beginning of that victory. The shock of the attack wore off, and underneath it was determination. Steel, a resolve that we would not be defeated. The Japanese thought they'd destroyed the Pacific Fleet. They thought they'd crippled American military power. They thought they'd bought themselves time and space to consolidate their gains in Asia. They were wrong on all counts. Within 6 months, we'd fought them to a draw the Battle of the Coral Sea and handed them a decisive defeat at a Midway, a battle that changed the course of the Pacific War. Within a year, we were on the offensive. Within 4 years, we'd won. Pearl Harbor didn't break us, it forged us. I want to talk about guilt for a minute. Survivor's guilt, they call it now. The feeling that you should have died with the others, that you don't deserve to have lived when so many didn't. I felt it. God, did I feel it. Why did I survive when the guys from my gun crew didn't? We were standing right next to each other. A bomb hit near them and not near me. That's the only difference. Luck, chance, fate, whatever you want to call it. Why did I make it off the ship when hundreds didn't? I was faster. I was luckier. I knew which way to swim. There's no good answer. There's no reason. It just happened. For a long time, I felt like I didn't deserve to have survived, like I should have done more, should have saved more people, should have been better, faster, stronger. It took me years, decades, to understand that survival isn't something you earn or deserve. Sometimes you live and sometimes you die, and there's not always a reason for it. What matters is what you do with the life you've been given, how you honor the memory of those who didn't make it. I like to think I've done that. I lived a good life, had a family, worked hard, tried to be a good person, told this story when people needed to hear it. That's all any of us can do. Every year on December 7th, the survivors gather at Pearl Harbor for a memorial ceremony. Or we used to, when there were more of us. Now there are so few Pearl Harbor survivors left that the gatherings are smaller. Time takes its toll. We're all in our late 90s or older now, those of us who are still here. Every year, there are fewer of us. Every year, more of our brothers join the 2,403 who died that day. Soon, there won't be any of us left. Soon, there will be no one alive who remembers what it was like to be there, to see it, to survive it. That's why it's so important to tell these stories now, while we still can. That's why I'm telling you this. When I'm gone, I'll join my shipmates. But this story, what happened on December 7th, 1941, this needs to live on. Not because we want to dwell on the past, not because we want to keep hatred alive, but because remembering is how we honor the dead. Remembering is how we learn from history. Remembering is how we ensure that their sacrifice meant something. So let me tell you what Pearl Harbor means to me. All these years later, it means loss. The loss of friends, of shipmates, of 2,403 Americans who never got to live out their lives. It means resilience. The ability of a nation to take a devastating blow and come back stronger. It means sacrifice. Those men didn't choose to die that day, but they gave their lives in service of their country anyway. It means memory. The obligation to remember, to bear witness, to tell the truth about what happened. And it means hope. Because if we could survive Pearl Harbor, if we could come back from that, if we could win that war and build the peace that followed, then we can survive anything. I'll leave you with this. If you ever get the chance to visit Pearl Harbor, to see the memorial built over the USS Arizona, to look down into the water and see that ship still resting there with the oil still leaking from her tanks, do it. Stand there and think about the 1,177 men still entombed in that ship. Think about what they gave. Think about the fact that most of them were younger than you probably are now. Think about the fact that they were people. Real people with hopes and dreams and families and lives they wanted to live. And then think about the fact that when their country called, they answered. When danger came, they stood and fought. When the ultimate sacrifice was asked of them, they gave it, not because they wanted to, but because someone had to. That's what Pearl Harbor means. That's what December 7th, 1941 was about. A date which will live in infamy. A day that changed everything. A moment when ordinary people rose to meet extraordinary circumstances. I was there. I saw it. I survived it, and I'll remember it until the day I die. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for taking the time to remember with me. If you found this valuable, if it meant something to you, I'd appreciate it if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share it with someone who needs to hear this story. Leave a comment telling me what Pearl Harbor means to you, or if you have family members who served. But most importantly, just remember. Remember the 2,403. Remember December 7th, 1941. Remember that freedom isn't free and peace isn't guaranteed, and that sometimes ordinary people are called to do extraordinary things. Remember Pearl Harbor. That's all we ask. That's all they deserve. Remember.